harm in today's debate is not some labour unions somewhere in the world that do bad things. The real harm in today's debate is that the fact is that millions of workers are still working underpaid. Millions of workers in the developing world still don't have full rights. Ladies and gentlemen, the reality is that no, it's not that most countries are democratic, therefore they have enough power to sort themselves out. The reality is that millions of people are suffering, and that the proposition side brings us a side that says that labour unions are obsolete, whereas in actual fact, ladies and gentlemen, we need them and we will always need them. In my speech today, I'm going to be showing you that regardless of our case thus far, because of labour unions' inherent adaptability and because of the perceptive value that people have of them, they will never become obsolete. But firstly, in my rebuttal, we have to look at two questions. And the first one is necessity or harm. And here's where the proposition gets specifically offensive towards people in the third world. But then secondly, we have to look at the harms to workers and specifically looking at unions' incentives and what the proposition has brought to us. So let's start with necessity. Because the proposition would assert to us two things: that the minimum wage has already been established in the majority of the developing world, and that the majority of the developing world is mostly democratic, therefore people can fight for rights without labour unions. Now, why is this wrong? It's just factually untrue, ladies and gentlemen. Specifically in the developing world, most people don't have the minimum wage. Even if they have the minimum wage, they have tons of other issues. Labour standards aren't where they need to be. People are living in working in subpar conditions. That's not the reality. Furthermore, in all of Africa, autocracies and dictatorships are still a reality. In those contexts specifically, people on the ground have absolutely no way of fighting for their rights. Labour unions are specifically necessary in those contexts. So let's look at labour unions themselves. And here's where the opposition really doesn't understand them as an actor, who they are, who runs them, and how they therefore work. Because they would say to us, ladies and gentlemen, that the people who run labour unions have perverse incentives and so run away doing things that are bad for their members. Now, why is this simply not true? The reality is that a labour union is about representation. It's about people being elected to represent lots of other people, which essentially means that all the people who are members of unions have the power in that dynamic. They're the ones who give unions their power. And what the proposition wants us to believe is that in any dynamic, there is only one given union. That is not the reality, ladies and gentlemen. The reality is that people have options, that people can opt out of unions if they're not representing them. What does that mean, ladies and gentlemen? It means that when some unions do some bad things, those members can opt out of those unions, go to other ones, and moreover, this means that the first incentive of any labour union is to represent the people in that union. What does that specifically mean, ladies and gentlemen? It means that we don't think that things like just arguing for standardized wages and doing things that are specifically harmful to their members, that's just not the reality in most cases. That's not the reality in future. That's not inherent to labour unions themselves. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of politicization, the proposition would assert that unions are becoming more politicized and that that is specifically harmful. They gave us the example of a union wanting to nationalize the banks. Ladies and gentlemen, that was specifically because that was what the people wanted. Fundamentally, this objective, it might be tied to something political, but that doesn't automatically take it away from being representative of what the people want. I'm going to deal with that further in my substantive. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point in the debate, we don't have sufficient harm from the proposition. We don't even have the right harm from the proposition. But even if they'd shown us some harm from labour unions, they're still losing because that's not today's debate. Today's debate is about the fact that labour unions still have utility. We still value them. They're not obsolete. Tell me why I'm wrong.
You're tying the benefits of your policies and labour unions to your mischaracterization of the third world. But how can a union pressure an autocrat, as you like to say, when the people in general can't do so? You have your characterization that the third world is filled up of autocrats and of no regulation whatsoever. But how can a union pressure an autocrat like the ones you're presenting when in general people can't do so?
It's about a world in which there are no labour unions, where people just have no power because their government doesn't care, versus a world where there are labour unions and people on the ground have some sort of lobbying power and some sort of established group that represent them on a public scale. But let's move on to my substantive, and here I'm going to show you under two grounds why beyond efficacy, labour unions will never be obsolete. And the first one is adaptability, ladies and gentlemen. It is not enough for the proposition to assert that labour unions can't change. We would tell you that even when problems change, labour unions have always been adapting and will always adapt to deal with those problems. Where their overarching goal stays to be protecting workers, within that, the way they protect them can change and does. This is on two levels, and the first one is in terms of technology. We see this trend, ladies and gentlemen, where labour unions have started to utilise and to keep up with how society functions. When their fundamental premise is attracting a membership and keeping a membership, they change with the way people interact in society. We see this in the latest trend of social media, where labour unions now have a Facebook page, now have a Twitter page, which they use to garner support. This is how, ladies and gentlemen, COSATU was able to get more than 200,000 signatures on their latest petition. It's because they recognise that social media is an effective tool to garner support. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, specifically when we look at politicisation, this is specifically good and a specifically positive way that labour unions have been adapting. In many countries where we do have a trend towards more inclusive democracies, which might have displaced labour unions in the first place, we see that they have adapted to leverage off those systems, and that is the key, ladies and gentlemen. It is about the fact that labour unions can adapt to whatever system is the status quo. We see this in a number of ways, in the way that they negotiate with existing parties, in the way that they form political allegiances with these parties, in the way that they directly form parties themselves. We're looking at NUMSA in South Africa, who plans to launch their political party before the 2019 elections. But the critically important part here, ladies and gentlemen, is that these political allegiances and affiliations are not necessarily harmful, and in fact are specifically beneficial. It's incredibly beneficial when we have a labour union which is able to leverage off political power, as opposed to people on the ground who would never be able to access that level of power. Ladies and gentlemen, because of this trend of adaptability, we don't think that labour unions will ever be obsolete. But moreover, ladies and gentlemen, we have to look at the specific value people place on labour unions themselves. Regardless of efficacy, the average worker on the ground perceives themselves to be weak in the labour market. The average worker in McDonald's doesn't think that just because of social media, they can take on a corporate giant. What this means is that the perception is that these labour unions are what give people power. To the average man, these labour unions are the ones who give them a safety net, who give them someone to turn to, who give them collective camaraderie, who assure them that they are not alone in their struggles. So on that basis alone, ladies and gentlemen, labour unions will never be obsolete. This is further bolstered by their historical success. The fact that so many women now know that they can work in their workplace and be paid equally because of labour unions means that in their minds they will never be absolute. Ladies and gentlemen, we understand that labour unions are inherently beneficial. We understand that people will always value them and they will never be obsolete. Thank you.